Okay, hi, welcome. We are going to talk today about the human impacts we've had on our natural environment. So our course name is The Living Environment, and we're going to end up with the last unit talking about all the ways that humans have had an impact on our natural environment, both negative and positive. So I'm going to run through it as quickly as we can. I can skip that. Do I have the wrong one open? Yeah, I do. Okay, just a moment. Oh, I can't minimize because I'm recording. Impact Zooms, this is the one. Okay. I just forgot to delete that homework slide, so ignore that homework. So this is a silly little cartoon where these fish called Asian carp, which are actually invasive, dangerous fish that damage ecosystems, say, as an invasive species with an endless appetite, they can decimate ecosystems and send species extinct. Asian carp? No, humans. Yes, humans have had a greater impact on our natural world more than any other species. And there are many species who've been invasive and they're from places where they're not supposed to be from and they've done damage, but humans more so than anything else. And so on that note, we need to have awareness and understanding globally about these problems so that globally we can take action. Because it's our entire planet that's at stake. And so just one person or one country making an effort is not going to do enough to save the natural environment. So human activities can create ecological problems. We've been doing this since we, more so than since we became more industrialized as a species and more technology as a species. And so we need global cooperation, global awareness, and global action. So there's lots of global organizations and committees that are formed to discuss how humans are having an impact on the environment and how we can fix it and maintain our natural environment, maintain our natural resources. So it's not just a one country effort. So in our environment, we have a very limited supply of some of our resources, and the fancy word for that is finite. It's the opposite of infinite. So infinite means, oh, we have a whole lot of it. Finite means we don't have a whole lot of it. Well, there's a lot, but it won't last forever. And then there's resources that can be replenished and can be replaced if we use them at a reasonable, sustainable rate. But then there's resources that once we use them, they're completely gone. So that's the first thing to know the difference between. So we have resources such as trees. Someone is trying to join us a little bit late. I will let them in. Excuse
Miss
me.
Miranda, we don't see the slideshow.
You didn't see the slideshow?
No.
Okay, shoot. Let me let Sam in and then I'll fix it. I'm sharing, screen share. Okay, what do you see, Ethan?
Now I see the slide. I see the slideshow, but I don't see it in like present mode.
Okay, yeah, no, I didn't present it yet. Okay, now I'm going to go to present mode. Now, do you see it?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, thanks. Okay. All right, so our Earth has a finite amount of resources, some resources. Others can be replenished. Trees, the power we get from wind and from solar power, our crops can be replenished, fish can be replenished. So if we use those resources at a sustainable rate, reasonable rate, then we'll be able to maintain them and continue to have them. Then there's going to be other resources that are not renewable. They are finite resources and we cannot replace them no matter how slowly we use them. Eventually they will run out. These are going to be resources like our fossil fuels. If you've never heard that word before, fossil fuels are created by fossilized dead organic matter from millions of years ago that are being compressed in the earth, deep in the earth, and the decay and decomposition converts that dead carcass of dead dinosaurs and dead plant material, etc., into natural resources such as coal, oil, and natural gas. So those resources are deep in the earth and we have to extract them. And there's a lot of dangerous components to extracting those resources, as well as the fact that once we extract it, it's gone. It's not going to make more for another millions and millions of years, which obviously wouldn't benefit us these days. So we say they are not replenishable. This is just one example of how extracting these resources is detrimental to our environment. This is a picture of a seabird covered in oil after an oil spill in, I think this might have been in the Gulf of Mexico. That was the most recent one. So scientists are worried about Earth's finite resources. Remember, that means they're limited because humans are using large amounts of some of these materials that cannot be renewed. So we have to also think about, well, what other ways could we use resources that are renewable to get our energy, for example. I'm going to skip through some of the questions. Let's go faster. This is just a silly cartoon. Oh, I'm going to try to save resources. I'm not going to hand in my report. I'm going to send it to you telepathically. Ha, 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 ha. Don't try that. Sometimes when we consider environmentalism and looking out for our planet, there's things that we don't think about or you should think about. So this picture, I just thought this cartoon like really drew that point. So at some point, people came for this gathering to have an Earth Day rally and demonstrate how it's important to care about our planet and take nature first. And then when it was over, what was left behind? A big footprint of a mess for someone else to clean up, litter all over the place. So let's not be hypocritical in our mechanisms of trying to help the environment or try to be aware of the discrepancies between what we do for our environment versus what we say we should do for our environment. So what can we do? We can maintain our resources, both whether they're renewable or not renewable, by just reducing, reusing, and recycling them. So reducing is kind of obvious. It means just use less. So turn off the faucet water while you brush your teeth. You don't have to let the water run for that long. Reusing means you reusing the material or using something that is reusable. So instead of buying Poland Spring water bottles, you can buy a refillable water bottle and install a filtered water filtration system at your house and just refill the bottle. And so you're not wasting all those plastic bottles. Buying in bulk is another way of helping to reduce the amount of waste that you're going to end up producing. And then, of course, there's recycling materials. Recycling is, it's sending it out to a recycling plant and the plastic gets melted down and turned into something else. Now, in terms of reducing waste and actually having a beneficial impact on the environment, they're not all created equal. When we reduce our consumption, we're doing the best for the environment. Just literally using only what you need, limiting what you use is going to be the most preferred mechanism for reducing waste and therefore reducing our impact and our footprint on the environment. Reusing something that was already taken in by someone else, like if you get a hand-me-down couch from someone for your first apartment, you're not buying a new couch, for example, you're reusing it. And that's going to be also helpful, but not quite as helpful as if you didn't have a couch. And then the last step is recycling. If you can't reduce your use and you can't reuse something, can you recycle it? There are a lot of materials that are recyclable: glass, plastic, metals, paper, cardboard, certain kinds of plastic. The town is picky about which plastics we can recycle here in the town of Hempstead. I think it's got to have a number 1 or a number 2 stamped on the plastic on the bottom. Otherwise, they won't take the number 5s. And actually, a lot of plastic is number 5, so it's kind of a shame that goes in the garbage. The recycling component actually takes up quite a bit of energy to recycle materials. So those recycling materials get picked up by a truck, and that truck requires gasoline to power it, to drive around, and that's going to have an impact on the environment. Then there's a plant somewhere that you've got to bring those recyclable materials to and use energy to melt them and to filter them and clean them. So it's not as efficient at helping the environment because it does still cost some resources to recycle. It's not as efficient as reducing and just using less. So it's good if you recycle your Poland Spring bottles, but it's better if you don't even use the Poland Spring bottles and you just use a reusable bottle and reducing your purchasing of the Poland Springs. This is a little upsetting to look at. This was going around the internet maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. I forget how long. This is a sea turtle who ended up with a plastic straw up its nose, and it was found by people who are going to pull that plastic straw out of its nose. And since this video circulated, plastic straws have become like environmental enemy number 1. There you go, they got it out. So they saved him. Maybe not number 1, that's a little over exaggerated, but there's definitely been like a hunt down, like no plastic straws. And so that's just an example of how reducing, reusing, recycling can have an impact. I'm not going to play you all these videos, the last straw and all that, but just if you use a plastic straw, it actually can't be recycled. It's too lightweight to be picked up by recycling plant machines, so it has to go in the garbage. And they're very lightweight and easy to blow away, and so they end up in the water sometimes, and that's how that sea turtle got one stuck up its nose. So now what has happened is there are companies that create reusable straws, so you can reduce your use of the plastic ones and reduce how much of them have the possibility of ending up in our natural environment where they don't belong. So these are just some examples of reusable straws. Or you could just not use a straw, which is also pretty simple. If you don't have, like some people have some kind of physical handicap where they need a straw, they can't drink it from a regular glass. But if you could just drink from a regular glass, then that's the safest and easiest impact to make on reduction of using straws and impacting the environment. Another cool way you can help the environment is to do what's called upcycling. So you know about recycling. You put your Poland Spring bottle in the recycle bin and it goes away into the recycle plant and they melt it down, turn it into something else. But that takes some energy to get it there and do that. If you can do that yourself at home and turn it into something else usable, that's called upcycling. So some cool examples of projects of upcycling are like these wine bottles that someone cut and filed down into being candle holders. This is actually a bag that you can use as a tote bag or a purse that's made from woven plastic bags. I had a student a few years ago, well, many years ago actually, who did this as like a hobby. And it's really cool how sturdy these bags are. And she made one for some of her teachers, and the Hope Club actually got into starting to make them a couple of years ago, but I haven't seen it go very far. Turning an old basketball into a planter, turning old coffee cans into, paint them and make them look like pretty home decor canisters. Toilet paper rolls are great for organizing wires in a box so that it's not a big jumbled mess. You have each wire in its own little toilet paper containment area. So this is called upcycling. You're, finding another purpose for the material you already have and possess, and you're just doing it and using it another way. We send a lot of our toxic electrical garbage to landfills, and they actually end up in landfills in developing countries. That's kind of like a monetary thing. We pay them to deal with it, so we don't have to deal with it, which is a problem. This is some garbages in some developing countries, landfills there. This is a young boy who is looking for recyclables that he can sell for his family. Just to make money, and he's just wading around through garbage looking for recyclables. So the developing world has a lot more of an environmental impact or visible environmental impact than we do in this country. So why? Humans are growing at a really, really high rate the last 1,000 years. And this is because we have technology, we have medicine, and humans are exceeding what we can call the carrying capacity of our Earth, and we're becoming overpopulated. So our demand for resources, our demand for space, and our impact on the other biodiversity of the Earth is increasing and increasing, as you can see in this graph here. There's a big spike increase of human population, and it's not slowing down. It's going up and up and up even more every year, the Earth's population. So this is an example of what the graph looks like for human population growth. Why is that bad? Well, we have an impact on other living things. When there's more of us, we take over more space and we're impacting the biodiversity of that space. So ecosystems that previously existed without our influence and our impact are being affected by us taking over. Typically, biodiversity is a good thing. You want to have a high biodiversity. It's going to maintain stability in food webs. We learned about that last week. And more organisms are likely to be able to survive and maintain their ecosystem if there's more of them. If an ecosystem is impacted by humans and biodiversity gets decreased and lowered, then it's a less stable ecosystem and fewer organisms are likely to survive should there be any changes in that environment. We also have an impact on biodiversity by removing species that we might not even have known had a useful application, like a medicinal value. So we actually get medicine from some species, from plants, and there's actually a whole state lab that we didn't get to do, of course, because we're on remote learning, where we search for the closest relative to a fake plant called Botanicurus that can have a cure for an ability to cure cancer. Fake plant doesn't really exist, but the concept is real. We do get medicinal value from other species, and if we are endangering them and threatening them in threats to biodiversity, then of course we're going to have less opportunity to use those types of medicinal value plants. This is just a little comparison. Which is a more stable ecosystem? The ecosystem that has more biodiversity is more stable. So the natural occurring rainforest is more stable than the crops growing. So in slide B, picture B, we've cut down all the naturally occurring organisms and plants, and we've planted just one crop to grow for farming. It's not as stable as a naturally occurring ecosystem with multiple species all living there, because multiple species being there is more biodiversity, and biodiversity is going to be more stable in that light. So we've made a lot of threats to biodiversity with our expansion and our lack of understanding about the importance of maintaining the environment, but we're doing things to fix it. So we've threatened populations, some of them to the point of where they've become endangered or even extinct. And you did this last week when you did your endangered species project. So some of you picked either an endangered or a threatened species, and here in New York, and you had to describe it and how we've caused its decline. So things like invading on their environment, cutting down forests, we've threatened biodiversity, polluting ponds, we've threatened biodiversity for a variety of species on our planet. Ignore that, ignore that, ignore that. Okay. So we're going to get into just kind of as much as I can, and then we're going to pause and you can do the rest on Wednesday. What else have we done? We've cut down trees, and we call this process deforestation. Now, we need to cut down trees because we need lumber, we need paper, we need wood to build homes. So cutting down trees and doing that, we're destroying the habitat of the organisms that naturally live there, and we're reducing biodiversity. And as you remember, trees produce oxygen via photosynthesis. So we're going to be reducing oxygen in the air and increasing carbon dioxide. And another thing we do is we don't rotate. Well, now we do it, but when we were causing problems, we didn't rotate crops enough, and the soil nutrients would get depleted, which of course means the next time you try to grow something there, it's not going to grow as well. It's not going to grow as healthy. So we have ways of fixing this now. So instead of just cutting down forests, we replant. We do reforestation. And instead of just growing the same thing in the same plot of land when you're growing crops, we don't do that anymore. We rotate the crops. Or when we harvest the crops, we don't cut the entire. We don't pull it out by the roots. We'll actually cut it and leave the bottom piece of the stalk to like decompose naturally, and it naturally like refertilizes the soil as we rotate fields and grow in like a new area of the field. So we've learned our lesson in some ways. The soil can become more acidic than it should be when we have too much animal waste, like from a farm in a very small area, and the animals are confined in a small area, and their animal waste ends up increasing the soil's acidity. That's going to have an impact on using the soil later if you wanted to try to grow something. So one of the ways we're trying to fix these problems is coming up with alternatives. So one example of an alternative, instead of cutting down a whole forest to clear land to have a farm, you can actually farm and plant around the naturally existing forest. There are some crops that grow really well in the shade. An example is called coffee, shade-grown coffee. So shade-grown coffee beans are going to be beneficial because you're growing the crop, you're able to grow the crop and sell the crop, but you're maintaining the natural biodiversity of the ecosystem by not cutting down the trees of the natural forest. So the songbirds that live there can still live there, and we're not reducing biodiversity. And I'm going to skip through the practice questions, don't need that. So in addition to taking down too many trees, we're also over harvesting and over hunting other organisms. We're overfishing the oceans. If we take too many fish out of the ocean, then don't allow enough time for the fish populations to build up again, then we're going to run out of fish. Same thing with plants. If we over harvest plants, we're going to run out of those species. Really terrible to see some of these pictures is the exploitation of wildlife for purposes that are not even things that help us live. So, it's one thing to hunt and kill animals so that we can eat them and use them to survive. It's a totally different thing to hunt and kill animals just so we can have trinkets and ornaments and symbols of wealth. So that's called exploitation. So this rhino was killed just for its horn because a rhino horn is like a symbol of status and wealth in some cultures. These sea turtles, their shells are going to be, you actually can eat sea turtle, and there are some Caribbean countries that do eat sea turtle soup. But these, sea turtles are often being taken just for their shell and just for their like trinket and ornamental value, which is unfortunate. This is called exploitation. Poaching is the illegal hunting or trapping of animals for this purpose. And this obviously is going to lead to endangerment and extinctions. The rhino, the African elephants, they're used for their tusks. Those are all reducing in numbers, and many of them are endangered. And one rhino very recently went extinct. I think it was the white rhino in Africa went extinct like within the last year or two. Coral is another example that gets exploited or damaged. People are like, oh, coral's pretty, I'm gonna grab it and bring a piece to my aquarium. Elephants get killed for their ivory, for their tusks, etc. Other things that we've done that have been negatively impacting ecosystems is sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident, we bring species that don't belong in that ecosystem. So you learned about food webs last week, and you know a food webs is a delicate balance between who eats who and the populations keep each other in check. If you introduce an organism that doesn't belong in that food web, that doesn't get eaten by another organism, or that, you know, that can kind of overpopulate and not be kept in check, that's going to be a problem for all the other organisms in that food web. So these are called invasive species. Sometimes they're called imported species. It's the same thing. And sometimes they're brought in on purpose, and sometimes it's by accident. I'll give you a couple of examples. So when this happens, it might sound like, oh, we're bringing in a new species, so we're actually helping biodiversity, aren't we? But no, we're not. Because if you bring in a species that doesn't belong there, it might not have any natural predators for that ecosystem, and it might be able to hunt and consume the other resources that were dependent upon by other naturally occurring organisms. And so it basically takes over the ecosystem. I'll give you a few examples of this. So they're disrupting biodiversity by disrupting the natural food web, and could actually end up decreasing biodiversity in that ecosystem. Sometimes it's by accident, they get imported on ships. Sometimes it's by the illegal pet trade. If you want like an exotic animal as a pet, they're not supposed to be native to here. We have an overpopulation of snakes. There's pythons. Is it pythons in Florida? Florida has like too many pets that were python pets. People will just let them out into the Florida swamplands, and now they're overpopulating, and they actually have a problem with this invasive species that's not supposed to be there. In New York, we have a problem with these beetles. They're called Asian longhorn beetles, and they came by accident. They came from China in wood pallets. Like the beetle was actually living in the wood when we made the pallets, and we're trying to meet the pallets, and then it came over here, and they do a lot of damage to native hardwood trees, like a maple tree, a hardwood tree. And they eat it up, and then the tree dies. And then as those trees die, that's going to be dangerous to the living things that usually use those trees in those ecosystems. Zebra mussels are another bad one. This is a problem in the Great Lakes. These are mussels, which is a mollusk, and an aquatic mollusk. And they're filter feeders. So when they got here, they came over in ship water, like ship ballast water, and they took over. So there's now more zebra mussels in the Great Lakes than any naturally other occurring species that were supposed to live there. They came over in the water on cargo ships, ocean-bearing ships. Purple loosestrife is actually pretty, and it was brought over because it's pretty, but it's not native to our area, and it overtakes and overflows overflows the areas from like where it's taking over. Like it takes over natural plants that live there. It also can disrupt water flow, crowds out the native plants like cattail plants, like these weeds you see here. So even though they're pretty, we brought them in on purpose, they're actually disruptive. This is kind of a big segue. So now we're going to talk about how humans have impacted the oceans with plastic. This is an impactful picture, seeing that this sea turtle has spent its life growing and developing with this plastic rings from a can of sodas or beers wrapped around its body. And it actually grew with this around its body, and therefore its shell shape was altered because of this plastic wrapped around its body. So it's a little disturbing to see that this is what this turtle is experiencing in its life. This bird obviously has a plastic bag wrapped around its body, its beak and its legs are sticking out. There's a lot of plastic in our ocean. There's certain patches of garbage floating around in our ocean based on where ocean currents go. These are a few regions where the big patches are. Plastic getting into the ocean is a problem mostly in other developing countries. So some countries are still just dumping into the oceans. We do not do that here in the United States, but it's still a global effort to try to provide these countries with the education and the technology and the infrastructure to have plastic disposal and plastic recycling, and we're just not there yet. So it's still ending up in the water. And so the water is getting polluted. I'm going to stop after this. So the water is getting polluted with plastic. Water gets polluted with other things like chemicals as well. There are toxic wastes that end up in our waterways being dumped from cities or farms or industries. Farms end up putting fertilizer that gets into the water. Pesticides end up getting into the water. DDT is a big pesticide that's currently banned with use here in the United States. Heavy metals, lead and mercury from factories end up in the water. And what the problem with these chemicals ending up in the water is that the chemicals are pretty well spread out and at the lower levels of the food chain. But as a low-level organism on the food chain, like plankton, gets eaten by a small fish, the concentration of the chemicals magnifies. And then as the small fish gets eaten by a big fish, the concentration of the chemical magnifies even further. And then as the big fish gets eaten by a bird, which gets eaten by a bigger bird, those concentrations increase even more so. And so DDT is one example of a fertilizer, of a pesticide that ended up in the waterways, and it actually worked its way up the food chain and accumulated. And its biggest impact was on birds laying their eggs, bald eagles laying their eggs, and high predatory birds laying their eggs. Their eggs were actually being affected by these chemicals in their tissue. And so they were laying faulty eggs, and the eggs wouldn't end up hatching any young. And so we saw their populations decreasing. And once we figured this out, we eliminated use of this pesticide, and we have seen those populations increasing. This is called biomagnification, bioaccumulation. The same thing happens with mercury. Mercury, for example, is going to be at higher levels in higher fish, higher on the food chain. So that's why we talked about this with like our nervous system unit, and our reproductive unit. You want to avoid eating high-level fish more than like once a week, because your mercury level in your tissue is going to be higher if you eat those fish versus if you eat simpler, smaller fish that are lower on the food chain. They don't have as much mercury in their tissue. It's just all about accumulating up the food chain. So these pesticides end up in the water. We want to try to reduce the pesticide use because we see these problems happening. So what are some things we can do? We can instill different kinds of controls to try to get rid of pests and bugs instead of pesticides. We can decrease pesticide use by putting in what we call a natural predator. So in this picture, you see the little birdhouse there. This is a birdhouse for a bird called a tree swallow. And this tree swallow loves to eat mosquitoes and mosquito larvae. And so introducing the tree swallow to areas that are prone to mosquitoes is a natural way to try to reduce mosquito populations, which are typically a pest that you want to get rid of. So instead of spraying pesticides, you can just introduce this natural predator to the area, as long as it's supposed to be in the area. You know, we've got to be careful of crossing the invasive species line here. And it's a way of trying to avoid using pesticides. We also can use sex hormones to actually attract and trap pests and get rid of them that way without spraying chemical pesticides, which can get into the waterway. This is an example of water that is polluted with excess nitrogen. So this whole pond is green because of too much algae growing there. Remember, everything that grows in an ecosystem is supposed to be in a delicate balance. Populations be kept in check by the limiting factors of an ecosystem. So if you end up with too much nitrogen in this ecosystem, then it's going to be a boom, population boom of algae growth. And the algae are doing great. They're like, woohoo, we have a lot of algae here. But that's not going to be a good thing for the other organisms in this ecosystem. The reason there is so much nitrogen is typically from excessive fertilizers running off from farms and getting into waterways and getting into natural rivers and lakes and streams and ponds. And that's where the nitrogen is coming from. Excess fertilizer has a lot of nitrogen in it. And so when there's too much algae here, they basically like form a cloud over the water, and light can't get through. And we're actually going to see a reduction in oxygen because the algae are not only making oxygen, but they also use oxygen because they're not just photosynthetic. They also need oxygen for their own respiration. And since there's so much algae, it's going to be out of check in population compared to the other organisms. And they're going to be using more oxygen, depleting the oxygen in the water, so that the fish aren't able to have as much dissolved oxygen. So organisms end up dying due to this imbalance of population when there's an excess of algae growth. This is called an algal bloom. Eutrophication, when it's like green like this, sometimes you see like red tide. Red tide happens in the oceans off of the beach of Florida sometimes, and similar problem. Okay, more water pollution. Some other developing countries don't have wastewater treatment plants and like we do, and so they just kind of like dump their wastewater straight back into the ocean, which is a problem. And then there's one last type of water pollution where we heat the water. We're not actually putting anything toxic into it in this case. We're just heating it too much by using water for cooling our nuclear power plants. This is called thermal pollution. So typically you'll see a nuclear power plant pictured here on the left built next to a water system, next to a river, so that the water can be pumped in to help cool the reactors, because nuclear reactors get really, really hot when they're being used to make energy. And then the water, once it's used to cool off the reactor, gets dumped back into the body of water, and it's dumped back in very hot. The problem is that hot water doesn't hold as much oxygen as cooler water does. And so the oxygen levels are actually reduced in this body of water, and that can kill the aquatic life in that area. So that's another problem. And I'm going to stop there. Okay, that was a lot of talking. That was a lot of different problems. The assignment that you're going to see is posted for today. That is going to be you going through kind of like one of those introductory packets where you have a paragraph to read and then your questions to answer, and all the answers right there in the paragraph. So I think that'll be pretty easy for you to do today. But of course, email me if you have any questions. I'm going to end